Hey everyone, Margie Walden here with Peace of Mind, and today's video is going to be photography basics. So we talked a little bit yesterday with regards to anxiety and even some people that are having difficulty sleeping, some insomnia, right? Some ways to combat that. So before I begin any of my training videos, I just always want to start out with a quick prayer. So just say, please God, keep us and our families safe from this nasty coronavirus, and please God, get us through this difficult, challenging time, and hopefully that this will get over fast. So in your holy name we pray, amen. Anyways, we talked about a bunch of different ways to combat some of the issues with anxiety, stress, right, and some of the insomnia. So I promised you all a video on basic photography skills. So a lot of you have like a SLR camera and simply don't know how to use it other than auto features, right? Maybe that sports feature on the camera. So SLR just simply means single lens reflex. So it's basically the mirror that's giving you a reflection of what you're shooting. Pretty much is kind of the way you can think of that. Some of the nomenclature or parts on the camera we can kind of go over. You'll have usually a built-in flash. I have, this one is a full frame lens. It doesn't come with that. I have to have an external flash for this particular camera. Some of mine do have one. Full frame versus a regular is just basically everything that's in the image that you see is going to actually be captured. So you spend a little bit more money for a body of a full frame. The reason I went with that because it's a lot more sensitive to light, and if you're doing photos for weddings, it's very helpful for that. Other than that, any 35 millimeter pretty much is going to be suitable for most needs, what people do. Anyways, you have just your standard modem dial, which is up here. You have like a selection, and depending on, mine's Canon, so you have like M for manual, you have let's see, AV, and then you have TV. So AV is aperture priority, TV is shutter priority. It's significantly different with your Nikon, so you're gonna have to just refer to your manual for that. Then some of them will have like scenes or portrait. You have, what else do we have on here? A sports selection, and but today we're going to talk kind of how to get off of those autos and onto manuals. And on the back, you're going to have your LCD screen on most of them. Some of them are touch screens, some of them are not, and you're going to have to learn how to like navigate through those. And basically you're gonna have to have that obviously on. So right now I'm in what they call the bulb mode, and if I transition and turn, it's gonna tell you which priority you're in. Like if you're in, and it kind of gives a description on this particular camera what those selections are, like portrait, what that means. But again, today we're gonna kind of just be sticking with manual, talking about manual, and I'll tell you some ways to get off of auto and onto manual. So you have a power on and off switch, obviously, on most of your cameras. Lenses are external on those, right? So you have to buy lenses. Some of them come with you get a package deal and you get some lenses with them, but we're going to talk about the lenses. Your shutter buttons and some different operating features, your dials up here on the body of the camera, your main dial there. And your lens focus mode is usually on your lens, though. It's going to tell you whether you're in manual or auto as far as your lens. So whether you want to manually focus in on that or let the camera do the work for you. Cleaning care of your camera and lens, you just want to always keep it kind of dust free, right? You keep it in a nice bag that keeps it away from dust. Obviously water, right? It's an electronic. Protecting those lenses too. You're going to want to get some kind of UV. They have all these little lens caps you can buy. It'll protect the glass on your lenses, and these are usually right around 20 bucks or so, and you can, it's nice because it's going to protect that glass for you, and it's definitely worth the money to get those. Temperature, you want to keep them out of the cold and out of the really extreme heat as well. You want to turn it off and on during your battery exchanges, so you don't want to be doing a battery exchange on your camera while the camera is actually on, so make sure that you're aware of that. And then your batteries, you should always have 2 or 3. So have one on backup, because the last thing you want to do is be somewhere and you go to photograph and your battery's dead. It's going to be no good to you. It's like having a gun with no ammo, right? pointless. So really there are three things that make up a photograph, or three things that you want to focus on with regards to photography. And they're going to be ISO. So ISO is really the measurement of the digital camera's sensor to light. So think of this back in the day. Some of you may remember you had different actual film, and your film was like 200 speed, 100 speed, 400 speed, kind of like that. So your ISO is really the sensitivity to light. If you think of that, it's a sensor in the camera, and the lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light. So for instance, an ISO of 100 is going to be very insensitive or not sensitive to light, where a 1600 ISO is going to be very super sensitive to light. The thing that you need to know with ISO is at some point, some cameras, after that 1600 threshold, they tend to get grainy or pixely, your photos will. So you got to really play with your camera and know the capabilities. Some of the newer ones are coming out with, though, they're way beyond that, so it just depends on your camera. Aperture is the other thing you want to talk about. And so I'm going to show you a little cheat sheet here, and you can download some like that. But aperture is actually located within your particular lens. And your aperture is going to be usually stamped or indicated on the lens, and it'll tell you, like for instance on this one, you can see the aperture. Maybe not, I can't focus in on that. But basically on this particular one, this one will go down to like a 1.28, which is, so the smaller the number, the larger the opening in the aperture. And your aperture affects your depth of field, so what's kind of in focus. And that's what's going to help you to get some of that blurred background and that really nice portrait look when you're trying to blur out the background on something. And then your shutter speed. Your shutter speed is really the amount of light that, so think of your shutter speed as your curtains. They open up and then they close. So depending on how long they're open, it's going to affect motion or movement, right, within the camera. So that could give you a blurred. And so during that, you want this number to be less than the length of your lens. So for instance, if you're using a lens that's 100, you don't want to shoot a shutter speed less than 100, because that's when, unless you're using a tripod. And so we'll get into that a little bit more, but basically there are three things. So think of it as a triangle. You have three elements on your triangle. So you have your ISO, your aperture, and then your shutter speed, right? And that's kind of how you're playing with or allowing light to come into your camera. And if you can get your head wrapped around these things, you can really start to do some really cool stuff with your camera. So with regards to shutter speed, if you're performing any kind of pictures on sports, you want to stay at least 250 or above with your shutter speed, because you want that to be a little bit quicker. Otherwise you're going to get that noise and that blur again. So there's a cheat sheet for beginners that you can kind of pull down off of the internet. You'll see these if you just Google cheat sheet, photography cheat sheets for beginners. You can buy them. They have little dials. They're kind of like a circular that allow you to play with those. And then your ISO, usually your ISOs go from anywhere from 100, like I said, to 1600. They're even, I think this one will go up to 32 or something crazy. And so depending on your particular camera, again, that's something you're going to want to play with. So when choosing an ISO setting, you need to ask the following questions. How well light is my subject, right? Do I want a grainy shot or one without noise? That's where you're going to, need to understand how ISO is going to affect that. Are you using a tripod or not? And then is your subject moving or not, or is it stationary? Shutter speed, again, is the amount of time that your shutter will actually or the amount that your sensor will be actually exposed to light. So this can affect the clarity, like I said earlier, the blur, the noise. So the equal shutter speeds are going to be, you can pull down a cheat sheet for that too. It'll kind of give you some f-stop, which is your aperture, with regards to your shutter speed. So for instance, f-stop of 1.4, you have like a 250, a 500, 1,000, 2,000, or 4,000, or 8,000. And then when you get into an f-stop of 2, that's going to go 125, 250. And there's a little cheat sheet for that. Do you need to memorize that and know that? Not at all. So shutter speed, when I talk about noise, the blur, so I'm going to show you an example here. It's going to, so like when you're this, obviously the shutter speed was open very long, right? It's going to give you that blurry effect. Where this was really quick. It captured that and stopped it, right? While this thing was, we'll assume that these 3 figures were all in motion. This one captured it blurring. This one captured it kind of slowly. And this one was, so this is super fast shutter speed, super slow shutter speed, right? It's affecting that blur. Same thing with your fountains, or like an image or something that's running, somebody on horseback or, you know, motorcycle or something to that effect. So apertures is your opening, the amount that your lens opens up. And so the way I kind of like to think about aperture, so f2 is your really big opening right here, right? When you dial down to like f22, look at how small your aperture is. It's just a really small opening. So obviously the larger the opening, the more light's going to allow to come through, right? Less is less light, because think of it as like your pupil dilating down, right? So when your pupil is really dilated, it's not going to get a lot of light in, right? If it's really super open, then a lot of light could get into your pupil, right? If your pupil was dilated. So if you've ever had any kind of medicine for like any eye test or something where your eye is like left open and it's super dilated, it's really sensitive to light, right? So kind of think of it like that. Metering is another thing that you can do on the camera. And metering is simply like where the camera is going to focus if you're going to have it on auto. So you have evaluated metering. It's kind of, it's taking in the amount of light that basically it's trying to balance off of all of that. And then you have partial, where you're really, it's just taking a meter reading off of your subject. And then you have like a center weighted metering, particularly on a camera. I can speak to camera. Canon, I think center weighted metering, they also have that on an Nikon too. But basically center weighted is kind of like a combination of all of it, right? It's taking in all of that. So you want to be familiar with a little bit of your metering. You can play around with that. Not going to get too much into the weeds on that. I want to really stick to those 3 things on the triangle. That's your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. So the other thing you want to take into consideration is your composition or your subject, right? So what is your subject? What are your edges around the subject? A lot of times I see people, I think of this like situational awareness with regards to firearms instructing, right? So I see people will take a really good photo, but for instance, my husband, and he was getting ready to deploy in a few years ago, and I asked my dad to take a picture of us. We were out on our farm, and apparently my dad was really focused on us, but he didn't pay attention to what was going on in the background. So I had 2 dogs in the background, and they were, you know, bumping uglies, doing the nasty. And although a very funny photo, it was something that we were not trying to capture and we were not paying attention to, right? So I see this a lot of times with people. They'll have like a really great photo, and then there's just this random thing in the background. So people really get focused, that tunnel vision on their subject, but then they forget to kind of think about what's going on around it. So you want to kind of play with that and see, what are you, what are you framing your subject with? What's going on in the background? Pay attention to that. There's like rules of thirds. I don't play with rules. I like to be creative and do different things, but essentially you don't want to center your subject. You want to have them off to the side a little bit. It makes for a better image. Supposedly that's a matter of opinion though. But in actual photography, people like to use that rule of thirds. So like, just breaking your subjects up into, like either 1, 2, 3, whether that be here, here, or here. It's just using that rule of thirds to kind of where you position your subject within that photograph. Again, not a big rule of thirds fan. I photograph what I want, how I want. I don't like people telling me the rules on that. The other thing is you want to think of depth of field or shadows. A lot of times I see people, they'll put people in these really good images and the really pretty backgrounds and then they're like squinting, or they have these shadows on their faces because of the way the sun's hitting them. Ideal shoot times are usually early in the morning or in the evening because the sun's not directly above you and it's not going to cast those ugly shadows on you. If that is the case and you're out shooting, then you want to put somebody in the shade, right? You want to make sure that they're kind of even that tone. Sometimes shadows can work for you and sometimes against you. So depending on what you're shooting for, but we're not going to really go into the weeds on lighting because that's a whole different class. Like that could be a whole semester on talking about lighting. So color, sometimes people will say like depending on, you know, stick to neutrals and if you're doing like senior photos and things like that. But again, not a big person of rules, and so that's a matter of opinion, in my opinion. And so uniqueness, and I think breaking the rules, that's fun. How the viewer's eyes flow through the scene, basically. Think of that when you're thinking of composition. And then there's all kinds of videos on this on YouTube as well. But some special effects that you can get lenses, special lenses that'll do different things. I've seen people even put like Vaseline on these, and maybe even like create little things out of cardboard with a heart. All kinds of different cool stuff you can do. And then you can play with light. There's all kinds of different software to edit your images, right? You can get Lightroom, or you can get there's another one, Photoshop out there. There's all kinds of different photo editing applications. And then lenses. Lenses are the most important. That's where you're going to spend a lot of your money too. So the more expensive lens, the smaller the aperture, or the larger the aperture, the bigger opening, right? You're going to pay for that. You're going to pay for glass. So depending on where you can get these, if you're buying like a no kidding Canon versus some of the knockoff versions, you're going to pay more for that name too, but they're all almost pretty much the same. So you can get just as good as lenses if you do the research and go out there and get that. SD cards are going to be where your images are stored. I would get a few of those and always like reformat every time so that it keeps that. Shooting in the RAW versus shooting like JPEG. Think of shooting in the RAW where it's going to be like coloring with, I don't know, 64 crayons versus 8, right? You're going to have a lot more things that you're going to be able to manipulate in that software. So for instance, if you take a photograph and it's overexposed, you can later play with that a lot. I mean, you can manipulate that aperture down. You can manipulate all kinds of things if you shoot in the RAW. So there's some bigger advantages of doing that, and I highly recommend it. Some cameras like mine will allow you to shoot both. So you can do a JPEG image and a RAW image, so that if you do need to edit and photograph that later, you can do that. You want to pay attention to what those SD cards are. A lot of times they'll go on sale, and it's for a reason, because the ones that are quicker, that have more meg or more RAM, they're going to be a little bit more expensive as they, you know, as technology advances. So that's going to help you out when you're downloading your photographs. And then obviously you want more storage, the better, because you can take a lot more images. White balance is another thing you want to pay attention to. So a lot of times, especially if you're doing photographs in like weddings, for instance. So white balance is simply like, okay, do I want this to be my true white, or do I want this? And it's really telling the camera what is true white. So have you ever seen those dingy images, as like I like to think of, or people are just like bleached out, or they're just, you know, just not, the color is just not quite there. That has a lot to do with white balance. And again, that's something you can fix in photo software, so we're not going to really beat on that. I just want to talk mainly about the 3 things that affect it once we get through this. So workflow is just simply how you're going to get your images off of your SD card onto whatever you're going to store them on, whether that be your actual laptop camera, or laptop, or I have an external driver too. You can back up a lot of your images on, and I recommend doing that. You can take photography classes here in Michigan. Washtenaw Community College has one of the 10th greatest, I think it's in the top 10th in the nation for, believe it or not, it's community college, but for their photography classes, because they have a lot of credited instructors. So they've like been published and whatnot. So they get a huge grant from Canon as well, and they're just really one of the top 10th in the nation. So I recommend taking some classes. Online, YouTube, seminars, you can join photography clubs. There's all kinds of stuff. You can even get on Facebook for your local area and go out and shoot with people and just start playing with your camera. The more you do some of that stuff, the better you're going to get at it. So just remember, life is like a camera. Focus on what's important, capture the good times, develop from the negatives. Well, we don't have negatives anymore, and if things don't work out, just take another shot. It's super easy to do with a digital camera, right? So in order to get your head wrapped around aperture and shutter speed, what I would recommend doing first is actually shooting before you go completely manual. I would say start shooting in the aperture priority. So what does that mean? You're just going to turn it on, and then you're going to be able to, when you use your dial on your camera, you're going to start to see, if you notice on here, my aperture is changing as I dial this. That's the only thing that's really going to change by me doing that. All the other things are going to be automatic. So your shutter speed. The only other thing that you would have to do is change your ISO on your camera. So that's how sensitive it is to light. Typically during the day, you're going to want, if you're outdoors shooting, you want to stick to like 200 to 400 ISO. And then if it's really super bright out and bright light, you may want to dial that down to 100. But again, like the darker it is towards the end of the night, you may need to get that up to 1600. So start by shutter priority. And then again, shutter is determined by your particular lens. So how much you're going to be able to dial down. So for this one, I can go down to a f1.8 on this particular lens. And you have that on the lens. It's stamped on your lens, 1.8. And that, what does that mean? So think of 1.8 is going to be a bigger opening, right? And so a bigger opening, if I have a really big opening, how much can I really focus in on, right? Think of like if you close your eye and you're really focusing on your sights on a gun, you're going to really focus in on that. But if you have both eyes open, you're kind of not able to focus as much on that. So that gives you that blurred background. So the larger the opening, the less depth of field, or the more of a blurred background. So it's only going to focus on one thing. And so, for instance, an f8 is really going to just focus on like maybe your person's head, right? Where, or f1.8, I should say. And f22 is going to focus on your person, but then all the things that are kind of going around in the background, maybe some trees or some other things like that. So the bigger the number, the more in focus. Think of that. The less of the number, so 1.8, then the less in focus. So you're really going to have to figure out what you're dialed in on or what you're focused in on, whether you're doing it manual or using the auto. And so that will help you with that. Then the next thing I would challenge you to do is start shooting with your shutter priority, which is on Canon, it's your TV. So what does shutter affect? Again, that's going to affect your motion, right? Or your like your speed. So if you're taking a picture, you've seen probably like the famous Jimmy Dean pictures where there's a car driving and then you see the light, the beams of light. Because what they've done there is they've really dialed down on that aperture to maybe like an f22, which is really small opening, and maybe dialed down really small on that ISO, so like 100. So it's really not sensitive to light. Now a lot of light's getting through that aperture. It's going to allow for that shutter to be open more, right? And so the longer the shutter is open, then the more motion you're going to get into your picture. The less, if it goes snap, snap, it's going to catch that image probably here, right? Versus if you leave it open for a long time, you're going to kind of get that more of a blurred effect. And so that's how you want to think of shutter. Like it's open for a really long time, so you're going to get a lot more movement in there because it's capturing that for a longer time, right? And so if once you start playing with that, you're going to start to understand and go, okay, now I understand why I got a blurry image. And sometimes you want that blurred image and sometimes you don't. So they have a technique called panning. Like if somebody's maybe riding their horse, right? And you follow the person that's riding their horse. I'm a horrible artist, obviously. But so pretend somebody's like sitting here and they're riding their horse and you pan, you follow the image, and the background then going to become blurry. Or maybe somebody riding a motorcycle or a four-wheeler or something. So you're following the image for so many seconds. You're going to be able to get that image really in focus if you kind of stay with it. and then you'll get a blurred background. So that's what's fun about shutter speed and why it's important. But shutter speed, you want a really fast shutter speed if you're trying to catch a sports image, right? You want to catch somebody in midair, or somebody riding a bull getting bucked off or something like that. You want a really super fast shutter speed because you want to catch that and capture that, and you want it to be in focus and not blurry, right? And so that's where shutter speed comes into play. Again, the ISO, so where I've really played with the ISO, where you can do some fun stuff once you start getting your head wrapped around all that, you can get what they call a neutral density lens. And this one was like $50. And it's like a sunglass that you put on in the front of your lens. And basically what you can do with that is, so it's going to pretend like it's dark out. So if you're, if you're out during the daytime and you're really trying to get something and open that shutter speed for a long time, maybe you're trying to get that fountain or water on a brook or something, right, or in a stream, and you're really trying to slow it down and get that blur, you want that shutter open for a long time, right, so that it blurs out that water. That's where you get them really smooth images, and that's where that gets fun to play with. So again, shutter speed has to do with speed or blur or action. Noise you don't want with that, and sometimes you do. Sometimes you're trying to capture that noise. When you want anything below 250 though, I would say you're gonna definitely want a tripod, because if you don't have a tripod, then you're gonna have a lot of movement and you're gonna get that blur and that busyness or that noise in your photos. So I hope that this is making some sense, and I do have a PowerPoint. If anyone would like that, just hit me up and I will send you that. It's just a PowerPoint that I made that helped me while I was taking classes to kind of get my head wrapped around and understand it. But again, don't eat the whole elephant. So I would recommend either starting off with aperture priority or shutter priority, understanding how that is affecting your images, then switch to the other one, get your head wrapped around that. Then you're going to want to go to manual and start really playing with the different things. And that's all of your different settings on there, such as you can mess with your ISO. You can also mess with the tungsten or white valence. You're going to be able to flip through and do some of that. You're going to be able to, let's see, what else do you have on here? So your white balance and all of those different things you can play with later. But again, the best thing about shooting in the raw is if you screw it up, you can always adjust those things after the fact. So that's what's great about being able to shoot in the raw. And then also with the aperture priority, if you're going to start out, just take the same picture of one image using the lowest aperture that you can use. So the biggest opening, smallest number, and then take that same image and just advance through. And then you're going to understand, okay, that's how that affects that. That's what that's doing. Same thing for your shutter speed. Do the same thing, play with that. And then same thing for your ISO. The big thing about ISO, where that comes into play, you're going to want to, if you want to try to shoot the moon, you're going to need a tripod, but you're going to want to like 1600 ISO, dial down to probably like an f11 or f22. And then you're going to want that shutter open for a while, right, to get that really captured. Have you ever seen it? Looks like you're just kind of almost there, right, with the moon. And you'll get some of those craters and all of that, and you're just like, wow, how did they capture that? That's how they're doing that. So it's really stabilizing the camera so that there's not any movement or motion or noise going on, and then leaving that shutter open for a while because you're just really drawing in all the light from the moon. And of course you need to do this out in the country where there's not a lot of light going on, because otherwise you're probably not going to see the moon anyways. But off of my deck, I do that sometimes. I'll go out there when it's a really beautiful full moon, and I just set the camera on the tripod, and then I dial down that ISO to, or dial up that ISO to like 1600, so it's really super sensitive. Dial down to like a f11 or f22 on that shutter speed, or on the aperture, I'm sorry. And then on the shutter speed, maybe, depends, you might want a 15 or 20-second image and just fun to play with, right? So just start doing some of that. Hopefully this was a little bit helpful for some of you. God bless and stay safe.